All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Um, First and foremost, thank you for being here. This is the second webinar in the QLI webinar series. This one is entitled Choosing a Researchable Topic. So we're going to build off of our conversation last week of different topic ideas you could have, and we're going to talk specifically about some methods you can use for honing in on a very specific, very precise research topic, or QLI topic, I mean. Um, Also, before we get into it, I sound like I'm very ill. So I apologize. If I may take a break to cough, I may take a break to drink some water. But please bear with me as we get through this. And then as always, if you have any questions as I'm going through the presentation, feel free to come off mute, raise your hand, or throw them in the chat. All right. And then at the end of the webinar, there will be a link that I will put in the chat for your attendance. If you recall from last week, if you were here last week, I mentioned that at the end of the QLI year, we will have a raffle for um, a particular award. And every time you attend a QLI webinar, your name will be entered in to win. And the prize is a certificate of recognition as well as a $50 gift card. So every time you attend one of these, your name gets entered again to win that raffle. So the more that you attend, the more chances you are to win that prize and be honored at the QLI award ceremony. All right, let's get into it. So our agenda for today, we're going to be talking about selecting a topic. The specific methodology we'll mention is first the funnel method, and then the 5 Ws. Okay. And then we'll talk about thinking ahead, so research variables. So this is once you select a topic, you have to ensure that your topic is researchable or you're able to conduct research on that topic. And we'll talk about what that means. And then we'll go through some past examples and close it out. So today will be fairly short, not too much, but if you've been taking notes, if you have a notebook, um, I would highly recommend if you haven't done so already to pull it out um, as we go forward. Excuse me. So the funnel method is kind of self-explanatory, I think, but a funnel, um, like a funnel, you start broad and you move narrower or you move into the specific. So the funnel technique essentially is starting with a very broad general idea, right? And then you move down into a specific question or a specific idea that can be tested that you will use to collect details. Um, so an example of this could be a very broad topic would be homelessness, right? That's very broad. So how do we narrow that down? Let's think about population, let's think of location, let's think of um, some other aspects of that, right? Another topic could be mental health. That's very broad. So how do we get more specific to where we can collect data on that topic? So some questions to ask yourself when you're starting in this broad place, trying to move down is, and this is just in general for quality of life, but are there any issues in your community that have affected you, your friends, or your family? And these are questions to ask yourself if maybe you have a lot of different ideas or you're struggling to come up with a single idea. These are good questions to think about as a whole. The second question is, do you want to make a difference in your neighborhood? Um, So thinking broadly, are there issues in your community that you want to change, that you want to make better, that have affected you personally, that have affected your friends, that have affected your family members? Because the name of this program, Quality of Life, is all about improving the quality of your community, right? So a good topic, a good broad topic to start will be, oops, will be something that has an impact, has a deep impact, a profound impact in your community. Um, because your job in this program, your goal in this program is to then take that issue, take that problem, using data, using research, make it better or change it for the better, right? So that's what this is all about. So starting broad, you want to think about how am I impacted by things? How are my friends impacted by things? And that'll get you this broad general idea that we can then narrow down. You can gather some ideas also by talking with your friends and family. That was kind of implied in the in the excuse me, in the last question. Maybe talk to your teachers, talk to your administrators. If you're thinking about making change at the school level, who better would know of issues than your principal? Um, and also, I kind of said this already, but think about your own experiences and those issues you're passionate about. You can also look if you're struggling with finding that broad topic, you can look at the news. Um, there's a lot of issues going on in the news, especially in New York City. Um, really, Google is a great source. ChatGPT also, you can go and search what are quality of life issues affecting Brooklyn? What are quality of life issues affecting the Bronx? What are quality of life issues X, Y, and Z affecting this population in Manhattan? Um, there are many different sources you can pull from if you're struggling with finding that initial topic, right? So now we're getting into once you have that initial topic, now how do you narrow it down? And this is the method that I love to use, the 5 W's. These are essentially 5 questions for you to ask yourself about this topic, for you to ask yourself to further specify what you intend to study or who you intend to study. So let's say you have your broad topic. Let's say your broad topic is affordability. Affordability is very popular right now. It's a very big issue right now. The first question is who is affected by affordability? Who is affected by this issue? The next question is, and you can answer the who. You could say, well, there are many people affected by this issue. So affordability, it honestly affects everybody except for the billionaires and millionaires. Let's say everyone who doesn't make, uh, I saw a study recently, a couple days ago, that said in order to live comfortably in New York City, a single person has to make $180,000 a year. That is crazy. But taking that, taking that, who is affected by this issue? Everybody making less than $180,000. Crazy. Now we can still further specify um, that topics with the next question. What is the primary reason this issue exists? Affordability. Now, primary reason. There are many reasons that the affordability crisis exists in New York City. Um, we could talk about the increase in rent. We could talk about the increase in energy costs. We could talk about the increase in groceries and food expenses. Um, we could talk about tariffs, which are increasing grocery and home goods expenses. We could talk about unregulated markets, like the unregulated landlord who keeps hiking up rent. So there are many different reasons that an issue may exist. And I think with this question specifically, your goal is to identify a few of the primary reasons or one of them, right? So what's the primary reason affordability exists? Let's say increased energy prices will be my focus. The next question is, where did this issue arise and where does it currently exist? Right? So, um, where did this issue arise with affordability? Maybe we do some background research and find that it arose in um, first in certain neighborhoods in the Bronx or certain neighborhoods in Manhattan. Um, where else does it currently exist? Now we'll get it. Now we're getting into looking at different neighborhoods. So maybe affordability is a bigger issue in Bed-Stuy versus downtown Brooklyn. Maybe it's a bigger issue in um, Washington Heights versus Prospect Park, right? So these questions, as we're going through to specify your topic, you should do this in conjunction with some background research, right? So you have your topic, you should be doing some preliminary secondary research or background research with these questions in mind to help you specify on a research goal or specify on your question, your research question, okay? So as you're answering these questions, if you're using Google, if you're using ChatGPT, if you're using whatever source you're using, make sure you keep track of articles you're finding, of websites you're finding, any sources that you're using to answer these questions. You will use them in your proposal. The next question, when did this issue become a problem? Right? So now we're thinking about timeline. When did affordability become a problem? I'm not sure. Maybe it always has been. But some background research would do very well to answer this question. The fifth W is why is this issue a problem? Why is affordability a problem? This is a great question that can lead you to your primary source. Because I believe I touched on it at the last webinar, but in your proposal, no, I don't think I did. In your QLI proposal, you need to have at least 8 sources, at least 7 of the 8 sources need to be secondary sources. So these are articles you find online, maybe a book that you read, um, anything like that. One of those has to be a primary source. A primary source would be an expert that you interview. It could be a survey that you conduct. Um, something something like that where you are getting the direct information. You're not getting information from somebody else who did the work, but you're doing the work. So it could be your own survey, your own experiment, or an interview that you have with an expert. So when we're answering the question, why is this issue a problem? Maybe interviewing somebody in Washington Heights or interviewing somebody in Prospect Park, um, Prospect Heights. That could answer the question, why is this a problem? Who is affected? Why is this a problem? Those can help you, or those answers you can get from your primary research or your primary source. I'm sorry, y'all. My brain is not working tonight. Um, and the last question that you can ask to help you narrow down and specify your topic is, how can you do anything about it? What are you going to do? Is there a potential solution for this quality of life issue? Are other cities using a viable solution? How are other cities like Chicago, um, Los Angeles addressing affordability? Um, and is there anything that you can think of now to address that issue? Um, so these are the 5 plus 1 questions that you should ask yourself when you have a topic to really narrow it down. And this will help guide your background research as well, um, to help you get to that research question and help set up the research that you will conduct as part of this project, right? So you have your topic, you do your background research to narrow in on the topic, and then you conduct research on this issue. Okay. So these are some good questions to keep in mind as you're going through it. And I did mention this, but a good tip is to keep a record of your findings. So as you're asking yourself these questions, as you're exploring the answers, copy and paste every URL that you look at in a Google Doc. When I'm conducting research, when I'm doing research, that's exactly what I do. I'll maybe go on Google Scholar, and as I'm looking for articles, I just copy paste the URL, keep track of it. And the next thing you know, you have 8 of them, right? So staying organized and keeping notes um, will be very helpful, staying organized and keeping notes. But now let's look at some examples. So this is very theoretical, but I want to ground it in some precise examples. The funnel technique here, broad. So a broad topic, climate change. Maybe that's your quality of life topic, your quality of life issue. Now, climate change is very broad, so let's get more specific. What do you mean? And where are you impacting? Or where would you like to look at the impacts? So let's say climate change worsening hurricanes in the mountains. Hurricane Melissa right now is the third strongest hurricane in the history of modern technology, um, or the history of since we started tracking hurricanes. Excuse me. Um, so that could be your main source right there, that data, the primary research, primary data is Hurricane Melissa. Um, so we've narrowed it down a little bit more climate change worsening hurricanes in the mountains. Let's go even further. Response times of government agencies during Hurricane Helene in North Carolina. So this got very specific. And this I wrote last year when Hurricane Helene devastated North Carolina, um, which we thought that was bad. We haven't even seen the devastation from Jamaica yet. Thoughts and prayers to everybody. Um, with the process that I used to narrow this down, starting with this broad topic, asking, oops, let me go back to the questions. What's the primary reason? Where did it arise? When did it become a problem? And why is it a problem? So some of these, what is the issue? Where is it occurring? And then more specifically, what do I want to look at in that specific environment? So I got even more specific looking at North Carolina. Where is it? The response time of governments. Um, in response to the hurricane. Now, you may notice there are a couple questions that weren't answered here, like why is it an issue? When did it become an issue? Who all is impacted? These additional questions you will put in your background research section. So this activity is just very simplified um, to kind of simulate the process of narrowing down a topic. The next example I want to look at is the mental health crisis. So that is our broad topic. We're going to further narrow it down looking at population. So depression in context. So depression impacting LGBTQ plus high school students. So we've narrowed down mental health to depression, and we've narrowed down the population that we're interested in, LGBTQ plus high school students. And we can get even more specific. So what do we want to look at? Why is there depression, or what's impacting depression rates? So rates of bullying among LGBTQ plus students in high school. And maybe we tack on affecting depression. Okay. Excuse me. So the reason you want to narrow down your topic as much as possible is because when we think about the research phase of this project, oops, when we're thinking ahead to the research variables, It's really important to have a precise, specific topic and idea because that makes it easier to design a survey, to design an experiment, to design an interview um, for this specific topic. And this is a process called operationalization. Operationalization. Now, you may have heard of this in your psychology classes if you're in psychology, um, but if not, we're going to go over it regardless. Operationalization is defining how something will be measured or observed in a specific study. So, to operationalize a variable means you define how it's going to be measured or observed in a study. It's going abstract to measurable and testable. Now that's very similar to this broad to specific process is abstract, broad to measurable and testable. So for example, an abstract idea of community engagement. If you want to measure community engagement, how are you going to do that? You can measure it in multiple ways. Let's say you define it as the number of hours per week that students volunteer. That's great. Um, Operationalizing variables is important for science and for research as a whole because it helps people understand what you're measuring. It helps you understand what you're measuring. It helps ensure that the research is consistent and that you can collect quantitative and qualitative data that supports your hypothesis, right? So defining what you're going to study, what you're going to measure is important for that data collection piece. We have to be very precise about our topic, about our research question, in order to then define what we're measuring. Because I'm just going to go back real quick. This abstract idea of community engagement, if I don't narrow it down, then I could measure that in many hundreds of different ways. But it has to be narrowed down so that I can um, define how I'm going to measure it for my quality of life project. And here's another great example of operationalizing. So turning ideas into measurable concepts. Let's say your concept is stress. You're defining stress as the number of stressful events reported each week. And how are you measuring it? A survey. You're using a survey, and the person will score 0 to 10. So 10 being their week was full of stressful events, 0 being none. Let's look at civic engagement. So an operational definition for that, participation in community meetings or community service, okay? So how would you measure that? Count the number of events that someone participates in per month. Maybe you do this on a survey or otherwise. And then the third example, academic success. So maybe your definition is a GPA or a standardized test score, which these are a little problematic to measure success. However, that's besides the point. So that's how we're defining academic success, and we're measuring it using the numeric scale, 0 to 100, right? So we take a concept, then you move to that operational definition. What does that mean in context? And then how are you going to measure it? Okay. Now I'm going to share just some examples of past QLI projects to help you get a sense of the overall project, what it looks like. Um, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how each of these students narrowed down and specified their topics. Okay. So the first one, this project is titled, How Does Population Concentration Affect the Prevalence of Microfibers in New York City Water? So this title and their overall topic was environmentalism. So microfibers. We've all heard of microplastics, right? These are terrible things. You set a plastic water bottle out in the sun, you drink it later, you're drinking microplastics. These are not good for you, not good for the environment. So this team, their topic was like environmental protection or sustainability. And they decided to specify and look at microfibers. And then specifically relating the amount of microfibers or the prevalence in New York City waters with the population of that area. So their quality of life issue, their topic was the harmful effect of microparticles in water sources, ties to sustainability. Their background research and secondary research. So in the further questions they asked, they found that microparticles were harmful and were released in large amounts by washing machines. So in context, they found, or in the process of doing this research, they found why or how. They conducted primary research by testing water samples across New York City, Coney Island, Pebble Beach, a pool in Staten Island, and Wolf's Pond in Staten Island. And then they measured the amount of microparticles and compared that with the population in that area. And then from all of this research and background, they developed a solution. So, as part of your project, and this will be in the next year, once you've conducted your research and gotten that data back, you'll then sit down with it and develop solutions based on that data. So, this team, based on their data, designed a water filter with 4 different layers to reduce the amount of microparticles coming specifically from washing machine drainage tubes. Right? So, that follows logically from their quality of life issue and their background research. Another example that I want to talk about, this one, which was titled Active Hearts Mandating CPR Education in New York City Public High Schools. So, this team's broad topic, quality of life issue, was the lack of CPR education. So, specifically, New York City high school students are not required to take a CPR education course by the city. That was their very broad topic. They did some secondary research, they answered the other W questions. And one of the things they found was 90% of all heart attacks that happen outside of the hospital lead to fatality. That's a crazy statistic. Um, so they used this to guide their research, and they surveyed their school, they did survey research of other students, teachers, and staff, asking about their thoughts on mandating CPR education, if they thought it would be useful and helpful. And from that data, they developed a website, a petition, and flyers to spread awareness about the importance of CPR education. And they also wrote a policy for New York City Model Congress that was then shared with their local council person, right? So this team, they started with this broad topic of CPR education, narrowed it down to a mandate, and was able to connect with the council person and actually create a policy amendment because of that. And the last example I wanted to mention and touch on was this one. It's entitled Hues of You: Student Representation Through Art. And this group, their broad topic was on representation in art, representation through art. And they identified that the quality of life issue, they identified that the murals around their school did not represent the actual students. And so they did some background research on this topic, on representation, and found that murals in particular have an extraordinary power to make students, especially students of color, feel seen, welcome, and that they belong at school. And they also found that this representation is especially important in all educational materials like textbooks. So they used this background research to inform their next steps, their primary research. They did an observational study of their school's murals, and they did a survey of their peers and teachers. The observational research found that a majority of the murals were not in good condition and did not represent the demographics of the school. And in the survey, they found that over 50% of students did not feel represented by the murals that they saw. And so the solution that they built from this research is they worked with an art teacher to design and create their own murals on walls in high traffic areas of the schools so that more students will see it and these murals will be more representative. And so the hope is that students will feel more appreciated, more seen in their schools because of this. So these last three examples that I went through, I hope you get the picture of starting with a broad idea, a broad concept, and really narrowing it down through the background research to lead you into that research question, or specifically to what you want to research. It's all about, I'm going to go back, it's all about this idea of the funnel, starting with a broad idea and getting that to a specific question, specific research question. A lot of students will submit proposals where the title is, oops, oh my goodness, where the title is The Effect of X on Y. And I think that's brilliant because that takes the general topic and puts it into this very specific, very precise wording. The effect of population on microfiber amounts, right? The effect of representative murals on student happiness, the effect of CPR education on student confidence, right? So all of these examples, I hope highlight this process and um, um, give you some good examples of the process. Okay, that is everything I have for you. Um, Thank you for bearing with me. Um,